speaking of baptism, that's one thing that sets Presbyterians apart from a lot of other Protestants. Obviously, Lutherans would also
Yeah.
baptize children. I'm not sure if there's any other denominations within the Protestant category that also baptize children outside Presbyterians and Lutherans. Are there?
There might be some that would be non-denominational that
Yeah,
would still hold to that covenant
but it's not
view,
very common.
but not denominationally. Like they'd
Yeah.
be not affiliated to a denomination that I know of.
Yeah, it's not very common that other Protestants would
Correct.
practice that. So, explain kind of the thought process behind the baptism of children. Why do Presbyterians do that, and what was the reasoning behind it?
What was the yeah? So I think there's a lot of ways to come at this. I'm going to give the 30,000-foot view because we could be here a long time talking about it. And I would actually encourage, if you want to learn more, do reading. Like there's a lot of good reading that can be done. But basically, the idea comes out of the covenant understanding of Scripture. And so when we look at Scripture as a whole, a lot of people are going to say, hey, give me one verse. And we were talking about this the other day. Give me one verse or one scriptural proof that proves infant baptism. I say, well, okay, would you say the same thing about the Trinity? No, you're going to take the conglomerate of what Scripture teaches to build the case. And that's what I would say we have with infant baptism. When we look at the way that God relates to people in Scripture, he does that through covenants. He comes to Noah, he comes to Abraham, and Adam and Eve enters with a covenant. And so when we see these covenants, what carries with those covenants? A sign. We have with Noah the sign of the rainbow. We have with Abraham the sign of circumcision. And so where Presbyterians would align a lot of ideas and understanding with people who might hold to the 1689 London Baptist Confession, Baptists, we differ on this idea of baptism because we see a continuation of the covenant understanding versus folks that would take a Baptist perspective see a discontinuity versus a continuity. And so places like Colossians chapter 2, where Paul makes a connection between circumcision and baptism, that there's something linked here. The understanding that when we look at circumcision particularly, it was for the family, that never was a covenant just with a person, but it was with families. And so we continue that into the new covenant. And that's where then you talk about other passages of Scripture that might back that up. But you're not going to find a Scripture verse that says, go do infant baptism. But you also aren't going to find a Scripture verse that says, don't do infant baptism. And so I think this is where we have to wrestle. And while some people might have very strong convictions one way or the other, there isn't a clear prohibition and there isn't a clear commandment, as some would say. I think it becomes clear as you look at the covenants, as you look at how that all plays out throughout history, the combining of all of those things. And then secondarily to all of that, you have an argument from church history that it seems that some of the earliest writings that we have from the church fathers are mentioning these baby baptisms. We would call them pedo baptisms or infant baptism. And so that should carry very little weight in terms of what Scripture says, but it should at least carry some weight to say, well, it was a practice of the early church, so we should at least consider that in our understanding.
Thank you for listening to that interview clip. If you enjoyed it and you want to listen to full interviews and learn more about religion, not just from academia, but from people who actually believe in these religions, subscribe to this podcast. And as always, friends, go out there and light the world yourselves.